Good Country Index, Wikipedia Audio. The Good Country Index measures how much each of the 163 countries on the list contribute to the planet, and to the human race, through their policies and behaviors. The Good Country Index is a composite statistic of 35 data points mostly generated by the United Nations. These data points are combined into a common measure which gives an overall ranking, and a ranking in 7 categories. The concept, and the index itself, were developed by Simon Anholt. The index was built by Dr. Robert Govers with support from several other organizations. 2014 Top 10 Overall Rank. The top 3 countries in the 2014 list were Ireland, Finland, and Switzerland. 9 of the top 10 countries in overall rankings are in Western Europe, while Canada tops overall rankings in North America. The last 3 countries on the list are Iraq, Libya, and Vietnam. The index attempts to measure the global impacts of national policies and behaviors, what the country contributes to the global commons, and what they take away. The index utilizes 35 data points, 5 for each of 7 categories. These data points are produced by the United Nations and by other international agencies, with a few by NGOs and other organizations. Science and technology, culture, international peace and security, world order, planet and climate, prosperity and equality, health and well-being. Countries receive scores on each indicator as a fractional rank relative to all countries for which data are available. The category rankings are based on mean fractional ranks of the 5 indicators per category. The overall rank is based on the average of the category ranks. This yields a common measure which gives an overall ranking, a ranking in each of the 7 categories, and a balance sheet for each country that shows at a glance how much it contributes to the world and how much it takes away. Science, technology and knowledge. Culture. International peace and security. World order. Number of foreign students studying in the country relative to GDP. Exports of periodicals, scientific journals, and newspapers relative to GDP, number of articles published in international journals relative to GDP, number of Nobel Prize winners relative to GDP, number of international patent cooperation treaty applications relative to GDP. Planet and climate. Prosperity and equality. Exports of creative goods relative to GDP, exports of creative services relative to GDP, UNESCO dues and arrears as percentage of contribution, number of countries and territories that citizens can enter without a visa, freedom of the press. 2015 Top 10 Overall Rank. Health and well-being. The Economist's daily chart questions the validity of some of its results, but also calls the index a worthwhile pursuit by imagining how countries might compete when they aim to serve others. Description. Methodology. Number of peacekeeping troops sent overseas relative to GDP, dues and arrears to financial contribution to UN peacekeeping missions as percentage of contribution, attributed number of casualties of international organized violence relative to GDP, exports of weapons and ammunition relative to GDP, Global Cyber Security Index score. Categories and indicators. Criticism. Notes and references. Percentage of population that gives to charity as proxy for cosmopolitan attitude, number of refugees hosted relative to GDP, number of refugees overseas relative to GDP, population growth rate, number of treaties signed as proxy for diplomatic action and peaceful conflict resolution. National footprint accounts biocapacity reserve, exports of hazardous waste relative to GDP, organic water pollutant emissions relative to GDP, CO2 emissions relative to GDP, methane and nitrous oxide and other greenhouse gas emissions relative to GDP. Trading across borders, number of aid workers and volunteers sent overseas relative to GDP, fair trade market size relative to GDP, foreign direct investment outflow relative to GDP, development cooperation contributions relative to GDP. Amount of wheat tons equivalent food aid shipments relative to GDP, exports of pharmaceuticals relative to GDP, voluntary excess contributions to World Health Organization relative to GDP, humanitarian aid contributions relative to GDP, international health regulations compliance.